Here we go. It's Talking Pints. Yes, it really is. I'm joined by Hamish De Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, welcome to Talking Pints. Very good to see you. Now, in a way, your military career, your long military career, from what I can see, was quite conventional to begin with, because you get commissioned, you go into the Royal Tank Regiment, you work your way up, you're, of course, sent to the first Gulf War, you do all those things, you start to rise through the ranks, you get promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and there you are, a successful but conventional soldier. That would be a fair description of your first few years in the army?
No, absolutely. I never really knew what I was going to do. I'm from 3 generations of military. My dad was a soldier, my grandfather was an army surgeon. So I sort of stumbled into it. Stumbled into the tank regiment, went through a really interesting time, the first Gulf War, Bosnia and Kosovo, and then coming up to the second Gulf War. And then I got the news that I was not going to command the Royal Tank Regiment, but command the Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment.
Why did they pick you?
Well, that's a really good question. And I remember on the day, lots of people saying, bad luck, mate, you know, you didn't get a rifles battalion or a tank regiment. It was at the time where it was realised that we needed a regular regiment to do this. The Royal Tank Regiment at the time had 4 regiments and 1 was converted to chemical and biological.
Oh, that's how they did it, right.
So that's how they did it. And I just was fascinated by the whole thing. And as it's turned out, wind forward, you know, nearly 20 years, and you know, thank God I did. I mean, I'm still doing what I was trained to do back 20 years ago.
Now, the use of gas in warfare, I've studied this a little bit. I think I'm right in saying it was the Germans that used it at Ypres in 1915, chlorine gas, I think, and right through that war, both sides used very large amounts of gas and of blister agent in the form of mustard gas. And then after the First World War, there was this global agreement never to use them again.
You're absolutely right. Second Battle of Ypres, chlorine. Yeah. Interesting, one of the things, a lot of the chlorine blew back into the Germans. It's a really difficult thing to use. I'll perhaps come to it in a minute. Exactly a challenge we're looking at in Ukraine at the moment. You never know where this stuff is going to go. But the 100-year taboo on the sort of use of chemical weapons after the First World War, it wasn't really used.
And they were never used in World War II?
They weren't. People think Adolf Hitler got gassed in the First World War, and that may be held him back. I think more likely Hitler thought that the West was far more advanced in its nuclear capability than it was, and it was nuclear then that stopped chemical weapons being used in the Second World War. Quite ironic, really.
But in recent years, we've seen chemical weapons used in warfare, of course. Saddam used chemical weapons against the Kurds.
Absolutely.
Chemical weapons were used in Syria. And chemical weapons have been used against civilians as well, haven't they? So let's just sort of unpeel that. Firstly, Salisbury. I mean, I suppose we're almost back to medieval poisonings in a way, aren't we?
We are. I mean, it's a bit of a Russian playbook for assassination. Of course, we had Litvinenko here in London with polonium. We had a number of other issues. Going back, we had Georgy Markov on Waterloo Bridge.
On the bridge. That was the umbrella, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was a biological toxin called ricin. But then Salisbury, the year before, 2017, the Russians declared to the world they had no chemical weapons. You know, when we don't believe what they're doing at the moment, you know, let's not think this is something new. This is the way that they do their business. And then my hometown was hit in March 2018 with Novichok, the most deadly man-made toxin ever produced. And you know why they did it. I think it's into Putin's psyche. You know, he didn't care. He didn't care about collateral damage or civilian casualties.
We'll come to it.
He wanted to make the point.
We'll come to Putin's psyche in a moment. But what about Syria? I mean, there was an awful lot of talk, wasn't there, during the Syrian war that gas was being used, poison gas was being used, and then it was denied, and then people weren't quite sure whether it had been used. And this even went into Trump's first days, didn't it, as president, when there was talk of a chemical attack and Trump launched a strike. How much chemical weapon was used in Syria, in your view?
Oh, a hell of a lot. I mean, it's very personal to me. When I left the military in 2012, I ended up in Syria with the media, and then...
So you've been in charge of this for the British Army, but you've also done a stint with NATO doing the same thing.
I was commanding the NATO battalion as well. Yeah. So I had a lot of practical experience. I dealt with Al-Qaeda biological weapons attack in Iraq. I dealt with stuff in Afghanistan. Without wanting to plug my book, it was declassified so that my memoir could be published last year. So although I'm also an academic at the moment at Cambridge University, but I'm the least academic person, but I have a lot of experience, and I think that's where it comes to. But in Syria, I was actually there. I mean, I was on the ground investigating these attacks and coming back over the road to hound MPs, say, look, this guy is using chemical weapons against civilians. We must do something. And then we had that dreadful attack in August 2013. 1,500 civilians were killed. And we had the vote in Parliament. And I was there trying to brief everybody to get them to understand, because people find it really difficult to understand.
The complexity of that. The trouble is, we were trying to pick sides, goodies and baddies, in 2013. And the idea was, and Haig was Foreign Secretary, and this stuff's not straightforward, is it?
Because, no, not at all.
Because it isn't, these are great people and these are bad people. It's much more difficult than that. And I perhaps felt differently to you in 2013, because I felt, if you arm the rebels, who the hell are you arming? Are you arming ISIS? Are you arming Al-Qaeda? It wasn't easy, was it? It
wasn't. But what I was concerned about the civilians, because they were the ones who were suffering. Of the 1,500 people who died in Ghouta, 99% were civilians, because actually the rebels and Assad and his guys, they had gas masks and stuff like that. So that was why, and I think it kept Assad in power, because these weapons are morbidly brilliant. And without, wanting to go into too much detail, if you have no morals or scruples, you'd use them all the time, because, Assad had fought conventionally for 4 years in Aleppo and got nowhere. But 13 days of chlorine barrel bombs and 400,000 people survived. I mean, wind forward to Mariupol. If Putin wanted this over now, that is what he'd do. But hopefully our resolve is so much better now than it was back then. And there is so much difficulty over the whole Syrian thing. But it did, when both ourselves and the Americans decided not to act, it sort of gave a green light to every dictator, despot, rogue state and terrorist, that actually you can use these dreadful weapons and get away with it. The 100-year taboo was caused by people didn't think they could get away with it. And I think that's something we've really got to rebalance now.
No, that's interesting. Is Putin capable of using chemical weapons?
Absolutely.
Looks like it, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I've just been on a briefing with an ex-CIA guy this afternoon who knows the Russians probably better than most. And he thinks it's in the psyche. But it's crucial. How do we prevent him using them? Putin didn't think that the West would react when he invaded Ukraine.
Because he saw weakness after Afghanistan.
Absolutely, absolutely. He thought the West was a pushover, therefore he could get on and do it, get a bit of flack, few sanctions and crack on. Thank God we've dug in, because this person also believes that Putin will not think twice at the moment of perhaps using a tactical nuclear weapon. Because there's been a bit of ambiguity, from politicians, not just here, but all over the place. I asking somebody just outside, do you think we will strike Putin if he uses a chemical weapon? I'd be interested to know what your answer is.
Well, I mean, Joe Biden was sort of caught on the hop with this, and the answer is the West doesn't know what it would do.
Absolutely. And chemical weapons, fine, stand fast that.
Yeah.
But nuclear weapons, I say even a tactical nuclear weapon, which is 3 kilotons, 3,000 tons.
I'm afraid we'd have to respond.
We have to respond.
And but the key is they have to know that we'd respond.
Entirely. And I'm not absolutely convinced that Putin knows that at the moment. So I hope Liz Truss tonight, in her speech down the road, I think she needs to be very careful what she is offering, but we should offer it. We should also not necessarily tell Putin everything that we're doing and giving. I mean, there is a bit here. But absolutely, we need to say there is a Rubicon, there is a red line to be crossed. You use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and we're going to hammer you. Now, let's hope not everybody in the Kremlin thinks the same way as Putin. I'm sure that's the case. I think if he does use a tactical nuclear weapon, I think that might flick the switch for a lot of people in the Kremlin. So hopefully they will bring him down rather than us getting embroiled
let's hope
in
so.
some
Let's
dreadful
hope so.
conflict.
Hamish, strong words there from you. Now, changing tack a little bit onto some personal stuff. You are a sufferer from, I don't know how you deal with this, sudden death syndrome.
Yes, absolutely. Sudden cardiac death syndrome.
When was this diagnosed?
It was... Most things in my life are sort of vaguely amusing and vaguely offbeat. I'm a very fit person. I was talking to your people, I broke the world press-up record many years ago.
How many press-ups was that?
4,489 in 3 hours.
I think 10 would do me in.
Well, it might do me now as well. But I used to run army rowing. I'm a rubbish but very keen rower.
Yeah.
And
so fit guy.
Very fit. Just like Ericsson, Fabrice Muamba, other sufferers of this. And it tends to be people like us who are super fit, who this thing is right on the margin, but if something triggers it, it can be terminal, as we've seen. And I'm campaigning very hard for the British Heart Foundation and Cardiomyopathy UK, because whenever you hear of a young boy or girl who dies on a sports pitch, it's generally this. But if you know you've got it, I mean, I now have a defibrillator fitted.
Yes.
I still run every day, and if the worst happens, if something happens, this thing will save my life. As Ericsson is playing Premiership football, which so you can, if you know about it, you can do something about it. But if you don't, then that's when you have these dreadful things. So it's a question of living with it. But my view, seeing all the things I've seen on the battlefields of the world, and particularly in Syria, all the children I've seen being killed and everything else. Actually, it doubles. I had prostate cancer as well, and that was diagnosed when I was in Syria a few years ago. And I got the call from my oncologist. He said, "Yeah, sorry, mate. Actually, the tumour is cancerous." He said, "But it's a Gleason 6, which is the sort of fairly benign one." And I was in a hospital in Idlib, and I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm feeling pretty glum." There was a little boy in front of me who had been caught in a Russian air attack 4 weeks before. He had no legs and one arm. And I looked at him, and a little crease came in his face, and then his face lit up in the biggest smile. And I just said, DBG, get a grip.
Absolutely.
I gave him all I had, $50.
And it's all in here. Chemical Warrior. This is your book of your life and all the things that you've done.
Absolutely. And also, if I can plug one more bit.
Quickly.
There's a chapter in there called Surviving Chemical and Biological Attack, which we've published free online in Ukrainian and English, and hopefully it is in every home in Ukraine. So,
well, let's hope it's not needed.
Let's hope it's not needed, but there are 5 simple rules you can follow to survive, and that's what we're trying to do.
Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, thank you for joining me on Talking Pints.
Pleasure.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.